Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Thank you. It's now 9:30 and the hearing session into the examination of the Brentwood Local Plan is now open, and today is day 3. So welcome everybody to the examination. My name is Mike Warden and I'm one of the 2 inspectors appointed by the Secretary of State to examine the soundness of the Brentwood Local Plan, or the plan as we actually may refer to it today. Today I'm joined by a colleague, Inspector Yvonne Wright, and Yvonne,
good morning,
Mrs.
everybody.
Wright would just be able to say hello.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you.
Mrs. Wright may have some questions for participants as we move through the session. Some of you have been to earlier sessions, but some of you may have not. So special welcome to those that join us today for the first time. In the light of that, I will set out some points very briefly. All of you will have met Annette Feeney, who is the Programme Officer for this examination. And hello, Annette. If you have an admin or technical question or any concerns, then please let Annette know. Annette will be in the session, but her camera will be turned off, as will her microphone, unless we need her. If you lose any connection or you've got some other technical difficulty during the examination, Annette will help you. Today we have 3 separate sessions, and so for those of you who are with us for all day or for 2 of the sessions, it's important that you, when you leave this session, that you log out and then you use the new link, the relevant link for the next session. Otherwise, you might find yourself in a meeting on your own. If any problems on that, Annette will help you. Normally in this kind of examination would have gone on to explain where the toilets are and how to get out of the building in the case of a fire, but we don't need to do that. But we do have some other points in terms of housekeeping and the way in which we will proceed today. Please make sure that your mobile phones are turned off or put them onto silent, please, so they don't disturb us. When you are not speaking, please turn off your microphone as well. And please, when speaking, please turn on your microphone and camera. If you wish to speak, then please use the hand raise function. I must say that so far this week, everyone's done really well. I think we've only had one person who's was tempted to speak when muted, and actually nobody left their hand up, which was excellent. We have a session this morning which will take till it's programmed to take till 12 o'clock, and then the session on affordable housing will commence at 12 o'clock. I will see how things go this morning, but I'm hoping that we can either have a break. Well, we will have a break, or we will push on depending on how we're going as we get towards 11 o'clock. Right, can I now ask everyone please to introduce themselves, and I'd just like to check that everyone is here who should be here. And when I ask you to introduce yourselves, please could you just turn on your microphone and camera and just say hello and who you are and who you're representing, and then we are familiar with all the faces that we've got before us. So can I turn to the council first, please?
Good morning, sir. My name is Paul Shadaridian, Queen's Counsel, acting for Brentwood Council.
Good morning, Inspector Phil Drain, Brentwood Borough Council, Director of Planning and Economy.
Good morning, Inspector Jonathan Quilter, Strategic Planning Manager at Brentwood Borough Council.
Good morning, Richard Pestale, Director of Planning at Stantec, on behalf of Brentwood Borough Council.
Thank you, Richard.
Good morning, Inspector. My name's Andrea Pearson for Brentwood Borough Council.
Thank you. So that's the council's team for today. Can I then go down my list? Carla Holmes.
Paul Cronk, JB Planning for Carla Holmes.
Thank you, Mr. Cronk. Catesby Estates.
Hello, good morning. Dawn Adams speaking on behalf of Catesby Estates.
CEG.
Good morning, Rachel Clements from Lichfields. I'm also sat in the room with David Barnes, Star Planning, representing CEG.
Thank you. Countryside Properties.
Yes, good morning, Inspector. Laura Dudley-Smith here from Stratton Parker, representing Countryside.
Thank you. Crudace Homes.
Good morning, Inspector. It's Jane Piper from Barton Wilmore, representing Crudace Homes.
And the Estates and Agency Strategic Land.
Good morning, Nick Islands from Iceni Projects. For Estates.
And good morning, sir. Charlie Banner QC, taking a secondary role in this session.
Thank you very much. Home Builders Federation.
Good morning, sir. Mark Barrett from the Home Builders Federation.
Thank you very much. Hallam Land Management.
Good morning, sir. Tom Hill, Queen's Counsel for Hallam Land, and I'm joined today by Mr. Simon Elliott, I think is also on the call, who provides technical support for this morning's first session.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, Simon Elliott from WYG.
Thank you. M. Scott Properties, Turn to Us, and Clarebrook. I think represented by one person, is that correct?
Good morning, sir. Yes, that is correct. Sam Hollingworth, Stratton Parker, on behalf of all three parties, all of whom share similar concerns with the plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Tesco.
Good morning, inspectors. Selwyn Atkinson, Tesco.
UNI.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, ma'am. Mike Taylor from Chilmark Consulting, representing UNI Group.
And Wiggins G Homes.
Hello, Inspector. David Russell, Wiggins G Homes Limited and East Light Community Homes. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody who I've not introduced who's not represented? Thank you. Thank you very much. Right. I'd like to now turn to the issue before us today, and I'd like to make it clear that this morning's session is very much focused upon housing need and not housing supply. We will be turning to supply in other sessions in the examination, and so if I find out really that we're straying into supply territory, I will pull it back to need. Equally, it is important to recognise that I will not be discussing emission sites today. I know that some respondents have said that that if the need figure is more than proposed, then the particular sites would help to meet that extra need. But we're not going to discuss emission sites today. Emission sites are not before us. What is before us is the submitted plan. I will run through the questions as we've set them out in our matters, issues and questions. But I'd just like to highlight that, first of all, we've inadvertently put one question out of order. And there is one question which we put into issue 6 on affordable housing, which is really an issue 5 question. And that is question 37, which is about whether the plan has strategic policies which clearly set out requirements for designated neighbourhood areas. So I apologise if that's caused any confusion, but I will pick up that question at the end of this session this morning. So to start, I'd like to deal with question 30, which is concerned with the housing requirement figure. The housing requirement figure is set out in the submitted plan of 7752 new dwellings for the plan period. This is set out in policy SP02A of the submitted plan, and it equates to 456 dwellings per annum over the plan period. So I'd like to check my understanding first of all with the council. The starting point, as I understand it, was set out in the plan was 350 dwellings per annum, and then it was uplifted to 380 dwellings per annum based upon the SHMA, and then this was raised by 20% to further guard against contingencies to 456. And then if I'm correct, then the advice in terms of using the 2014 based projections meant that this figure came out at 452. Can I check with the council, please, to just take me through that very briefly and check whether that understanding is correct?
Yes, thank you, Inspector. I think, yes, your understanding is broadly correct. The exact answer is set out in the council's topic paper. And I think we can all summarise the past history of housing numbers in Brentwood of being a little bit turbulent. The council's got caught by various changes between OAN to standard method to 2016 based standard method, and then finally to the 2014 based standard method, which is what we had. But I think the simple point is that we knew there was a reasonable expectation that by the time the plan was submitted, the standard method would have changed to a 2014 based and to a number very, very similar to the 456 that the original plan was. So I could elaborate as needed, but we got to the correct standard method knowing that this is where we were heading.
Thank you. I'll come on to talk about various issues in relating to that figure. But at this point, has anybody got any comments that they wish to raise at this particular point? Okay, thank you. Could the council just explain to me the issue about capping? Because I understand that the figure does involve a cap, and a number of respondents have indicated that the figure should not be capped. And if it wasn't capped, I think that both certainly EAS and Hanlon Land Management in their submissions have given some figures as to what an uncapped figure would be, which I think would be around 511. So can the council explain to me the process in relation to the cap, has a cap been applied, and if so, what do they say in response to those comments that say that the figure should be uncapped? And then I'll invite those who are making comments on those to come in.
I think the answer to that question is incredibly simple. It is the standard method includes a cap inside its method. If you refer back to the PPG where the guidance is set out, that cap is explicit. So the council has applied the standard method correctly as required by the guidance, and that includes a cap at 40%.
Okay, is there anybody who has made comments in relation to that cap who wishes to come in here and explain? Mr. Ireland.
Thank you, sir. I think our point is a fairly simple one and relates to the what's set out within the PPG itself. And the relevant paragraph in the PPG is paragraph 2A007. So that's 2A007, which sets out that the standard method identifies a minimum local housing need, and that the cap is intended to ensure that the minimum local housing need is as deliverable as possible, but that the cap reduces the minimum number generated by the standard method, but doesn't reduce the housing need itself. So I think our first point arising for that is that a capped need is not reading what's in the planning practice guidance. It's a minimum figure, but it doesn't cover essentially the full objectively assessed housing need. That full need is the uncapped figure. The paragraph then goes on to set out that where policies are adopted with a cap, they may require an early review, with a view to meeting the remaining elements of the need as soon as possible. And then it secondly says that where a cap is applied, consideration can still be given to whether a higher level of need can realistically be delivered. So the process is, I think, inviting inviting to be carried out is an assessment both of whether the higher need, essentially the 511 figure that you identified, could be delivered. And I think that my second point in this is I think if you read that in the context of a Greenbelt authority, where there is intended to be a permanence to Greenbelt boundaries, I think there is a key role for the process in considering that higher uncapped need figure as an alternative to early review and to meeting housing need in full, given the intended permanence of Greenbelt boundaries.
Thank you, Mr. Ireland. Mr. Hill.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I would endorse all that Mr. Ireland has just said without repeating it. The paragraph to which he's referred from the PPG, I think you'll also find in our hearing statement a paragraph 19 and 110, where we make very similar points. The figure that the council are working with is just the minimum figure. And as Mr. Ireland says, the actual need is the 511. The PPG plainly invites councils to exercise discretion as to how they should approach this issue. And there's a very clear signal in the PPG that examining options to provide for a higher level of need will prevent or may prevent authorities from having to undertake an early review of the relevant policies. As Mr. Ireland says, we think that's entirely apposite for this particular case, and we are very unhappy. Our clients are very unhappy that the council's present position is that it would have to commence a review immediately upon adoption of its plan, because the plan's provisions are so constrained. So I don't want to repeat anything that's been said or just repeat points from the hearing statement, but I do endorse what Mr. Ireland has said. And I just ask whether Mr. Elliott, who provides technical support on this issue, wishes to add anything beyond what I've just said, sir, with your leave.
Absolutely. Mr. Elliott, do you wish to come in here?
Only really to highlight paragraph 11 of the NPPF and the fact that it is the OAN that we are looking to accommodate here, and not GLHM. That's the minimum. Sometimes it conveniently falls that one is and the other are pretty much the same. In this case, we clearly have a steer that the OAN is higher, and that's certainly where the local authority should have been starting from to accommodate. If perchance they couldn't do that, then by all means reduce down to the minimum. But it does appear that they've worked from the minimum and then disregarded the higher figure.
Thank you. Could you just clarify the points in terms of that uncapped figure that is referred to? And I think the figures in both Hallam Land Management and EAS statements are the same. Is that the 2018 figure would be 470, 2019 submission date would be 511, and then the 2020 date would be 490. Those are the ranges of what is the uncapped figure based upon your calculations.
I'm sure my colleagues can confirm their calculations. One point I'd make is that there's a bit of confusion with a range bit entering the system, because the PPG is clear that our housing need is fixed at the point our plan is submitted. The reason you get a range in some people's submissions is because they're rolling forward the standard method, which is contrary to the guidance, as I think we've established. So there is an uncapped number and there is a range, as is being discussed. I think I'd put our local housing need, I would put our current housing need number in context with the emerging housing numbers in this borough over probably the last 10 years or so. We have been testing the demographic need and the need for an uplift on demographic need in this council for many years. And I do not wish, and I suspect you would not wish for this examination to descend into an objectively assessed housing need debate about uplifts and strengths, market signals and demographics. But it is not the case that the council was blind to the fact that the standard method is a minimum. The standard method is significantly higher than any other number that we've previously managed to generate for this borough. So it is a minimum, as we accept. We have always tested demographics and we've tested market signals here, and the council is happy that that minimum is the correct number.
Thank you, Mr. Pastel. Mr. Ireland.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I mean, you can see the numbers we set out in table 2.1 within our submission, and the number at the submission date of the plan would have been 511 for the uncapped need, which I agree with Mr. Pastel is the correct figure to look at. So I think if in terms of looking at this issue, and the context here is that this is an authority which has essentially not had an up-to-date plan for many years, a 10-15 year period where there hasn't been an up-to-date plan. And one of the consequences of that in a Greenbelt authority is that has constrained the delivery of housing and therefore the delivery of people, the ability of people to move to this area. And therefore that is a factor which influences essentially a trend-based demographic projection. I don't think it's necessary for the examination to work through into those the detail of that, but I suppose the simplest way of showing that is that the latest ONS household projections, as we mentioned in our statement, actually show Brentwood's population falling over the next few years. So a continuation of past population trends in essentially a constrained environment would see the borough's population drop over the period to 2027, which is what we set out within our statement. And the standard method is an applied formula set by government. But the mechanics of how that works is it takes essentially a trend-based household projection as a starting point and then applies an uplift to that. And it's the figures that come out are therefore sensitive to where that household projection is. I think those are just some of the considerations that come into this point. And in those terms, sort of comparing against a previous methodology and previous household projections, I don't think is necessarily essentially the right benchmark.
Thank you, Mr. Ireland. Mr. Hill.
Thank you, sir. Just responding to your earlier point, yes, you're correct in terms of the uncapped figures. Our table 1 on page 3 of our hearing statement sets out the 3 years, and bearing in mind the submission date for this plan, the correct line is the second central line with the uncapped figure of 511.
Thank you. Are there any points on this particular matter, on this particular point, that anybody wishes to raise before I let the council come back? Okay, Mr. Pastel, is there anything that you wish to respond to from Mr. Ireland or Mr. Hill?
The only observation I make is that Mr. Ireland has introduced various other alternative demographic projections and points out that they are falling. The council acknowledges that recent demographic projections are a lot lower than the 2014 that the standard method is based on, but the council is not making a case to depart from the much higher 2014 standard method and the 2014 household projections. So what's happened subsequently in our household projections isn't very relevant, because we're actually using a 2014 based as we are required to do so.
Thank you. Is there any, Mr. Ireland, are you you wishing to make a point?
So I think, you know, if you read the detail of the PPG, I think there's an expectation in that paragraph to a 007 that a higher figure should be tested as part of the plan making process. That the ability to meet that higher uncapped need of 511 should be tested, and our core position essentially is that we can't see where that's been done.
So, Mr. Patel, is there anything that is there anything you'd like to say in response to that in terms of whether there is evidence that the council has tested that higher figure?
So I don't think you'll find reference to 511 ever being tested, because of course those numbers only came into being actually as we were about to submit. So this is one of the slightly awkward things with the evolution of the housing number in this plan. It didn't exist when we were consulting. But it is the case, and I repeat, that we have always tested higher numbers than demographic need, and the council's OAN prior to the standard method was lower than the standard method. The 2016 based version of the standard method was lower than the 2014 based. It happens that the 2014 is a very high demographic base for the borough, and that was explored in the council's evidence, including the SHMA. So the simple answer, you won't find 511 because it didn't exist, but the council has always tested its demographic need and looked to see whether we should deliver higher.
Thank you. Mr. Ireland, is there anything you wish to say in response? Or Mr. Hill? Mr. Ireland or Mr. Hill in response to that point, and now I'll bring Mr. Hollingworth in.
Sir, thank you. The only point I would make is, of course, that the reason that these figures are generated, or whatever the time frame is, that we don't have arguments about them. 511 is the uncapped figure for need for Brentwood, and that figure hasn't been tested, period.
Thank you. Mr. Ireland, is there anything you wish to add to that?
No, sir, I agree with Mr. Hill.
Thank you. Mr. Hollingworth, please.
Thank you, sir. Just on the point council raised there about the 20 or the more recent projections, which I assume is referring to the 2016 and 2018 based projections. So clearly those projections are well established as having understated the extent of housing needs. As Mr. Ireland notes, these are trend-based projections in any case, but the 2016 and 2018 based projections have particular problems when it comes to using them for the purposes of future planning, which say is well recognised, and your colleagues have been grappling with that issue elsewhere in dealing with NPPF 2012 compliant local plans. So I think that's somewhat irrelevant to look at the Brentwood figures and say, well, actually, the 2014 projections get a significantly high figure anyway, because we'd expect that for those reasons. And the other point I just wanted to make is we're concentrating at the moment on the dwellings per annum requirement. I'm conscious your question also refers to the total requirement, and Mr. Ireland did touch upon the fact that this plan doesn't address the full 15-year period from adoption. It cannot address the full 15-year period from adoption, which the NPPF requires its strategic policies to do so. And so that total figure won't meet the requirement, even if you were to accept that the 452 dwellings per annum figure was a correct figure or an appropriate figure. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Brent.
Thank you, sir. In terms of what we've discussed, one of the key points I want to raise is around the unmet need, which is clearly another element of the paragraph 60, and how the council responded. Is this the point at which you want to discuss that, or were you looking to raise that in another part of the hearings in terms
yeah,
of?
I'm going to move on
there,
to
yes,
look at.
it
Yeah,
is,
I'm going to move on to look
just,
at those proposed, including unmet need. But if so, perhaps it's best at that point, Mr. Varant. But if yeah, perhaps it's best at that point to raise your issue.
So, okay, sir, I'll phrase it now because I think, as has been pointed out, this is the minimum level, whether it's capped or uncapped. It's still the minimum amount of delivery that should be brought forward, and I think it's a concern that we have, and we raised it on Tuesday in terms of the duty to cooperate. Is with regard to the level of unmet needs. And it must be recognised that actually paragraph 60 says that any needs that cannot be met in a neighbouring area. It's not neighbouring authorities, sir, it's a neighbouring area. So that can encompass authorities in South Essex, but all in of London, unmet need. And it's an issue that the HBF has raised continually across the South, the East and East of England in terms of actually how is this going to be addressed, because no one is coming forward to actually consider this appropriately within their local plans. I think the council have recognised the principle that there are unmet needs within both Basildon and London, and that's recognised in in table 5.1 of the SA, and also in their documents to your questions, so in document F3B. So both those need to be taken into account. I think on Tuesday we heard from Basildon that they may well now be able to meet their needs, but I'd say that actually they need to provide the evidence. The council needs to show that that is going to be the case. But in terms of London, when the plan was being prepared, there was 1,000 homes per annum unmet need as identified by the Mayor of London, and the Mayor of London was looking for willing partners to come forward to try and address the unmet needs. We and I think many others had concerned that the London plan wasn't going to be able to even get close to that figure, and we were proved right when the inspector's report came out in October 2019, which indicated there'd be about 14,000 per annum shortfall in the capital. That's a substantial level of unmet needs, sir. And it is a time when actually the council were looking at their plan in terms of the consultation on the additional consultation, sir, was closed in November 2019. But no reference is made to actually this significant increase in the unmet needs on the borders of Brentwood. And I think the council has grappled with this issue, as very few councils have, to be honest, across the southeast. It's a significant shortfall, and it's not just the shortfall. It's actually how will this impact on Brentwood moving forward? How will it impact on the affordability of property within that? In terms, how will it impact on people moving into this area? Those are significant issues that need to be grappled with, and they haven't been by the council going forward. We heard about the significant commuting flows and the close migratory links between Brentwood and the capital. So it's those elements that need to be considered. I think the council may come back to say, well, paragraph 11 places caveats on that, and we recognise that. But I think what has to be important is recognising the difference between paragraph 14 in the 2012 NPPF and paragraph 11, which sets out that the council must provide strong reasons that the application of those council that seek to prevent development mean that you can't meet needs in full. And that's not just needs in full within terms of their own authority, but also within those from any unmet needs in neighbouring areas. So if you have a case where you have exceptional circumstances for the release of Greenbelt in terms of meeting your own need, actually those circumstances can equally apply to actually meeting some of the needs. That balance and that consideration had taken place, and at the present, I don't think it has taken place. I think there's been a particular failure to plan positively for the level of unmet needs, whether it's in Basildon or whether it's coming from London, and to really understand the evidence and progress forward in a way that shows effective joint working and a responsibility for those unmet needs that are clearly there. So I think That's my concern, is that you really you get that minimum, but then you have to look actually what reason behind why should we look to plan for a higher. It could be that you plan for higher in terms of not the cap, as Mr. Hill and Mr. Ireland have both suggested. But it could also look at even further allocations with regard to that. So that's our key concern, really, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Berend. So we moved on to unmet needs, which was my next point, which is really helpful that HBF have outlined it in that way. So in terms of unmet need, the issue about need from elsewhere being met in potential for need for elsewhere being met within Brentwood. Can I invite any other parties who wish to add to what Mr. Berend has said on that, and then I'll invite the council to address some of those points. Mr. Hollingworth.
Thank you, sir. Just in addition to what Mr. Berend has just said, we were mindful that in respect of London in particular, I believe it's document F3B refers to the GLA's Regulation 19 response to the local plan, or response to the Regulation 19 iteration of the local plan, in which they welcome the fact that there's a significant buffer on top of the Brentwood's minimum local housing need as proposed in the local plan. But clearly, as we've heard this morning, there isn't a significant buffer on top of that needs. That buffer only refers to the SHMA initial calculation. And I think our concern is that when the GLA effectively suggested that Brentwood didn't need to accommodate any additional need, as the council seems to be implying for this, they were under the misconception that Brentwood's local plan was already providing a significant buffer on top of the standard method housing need, when in fact it wasn't. And I just wonder if the council were able to clarify whether they actually went back to the GLA. As Mr. Pastell's confirmed this morning, the council were aware of the impending changes in the standard methods. I just wonder if they went back to the GLA and sought clarification on that point once it became clear that, in effect, the local plan was only just meeting the bare minimum local housing need as per the standard method.
Thank you, Mr. Hollingworth. I'll ask the council to respond in a moment, but I'll bring Mr. Ireland in. Mr. Ireland.
Thank you, sir. I think on this issue, in respect of unmet need, the council has, in essence, recognised that there is an unmet need from London. And I'm referring to its housing need topic paper, document F5C. But the suggestion that I think that comes out of that topic paper is that the council's not a willing partner in meeting that need. And so I refer you particularly to paragraph 3.37 within that document, which says, under the targets of the adopted London plan, the two boroughs most closely linked to Brentwood, Havering and Redbridge do not have unmet needs. The emerging new London plan sets new targets which in future may lead to unmet needs from London as a whole, though we don't know how individual boroughs will be affected. Those future unmet needs are not relevant to Brentwood's local plan today. They may result in additional housing provision at Brentwood's next local plan review, but this would be a voluntary choice because the Mayor of London will only seek help from willing partners. Now, the suggestion in that document is twofold. One, that this is not an issue for this point in time, and that secondly, the council is essentially not a willing partner for the London authorities in addressing that issue. And I think those matters, in my opinion, need further consideration. Firstly, the London plan is now at a pretty advanced stage with a substantial shortfall. And to come back to some of the points from the hearing a couple of days ago, that is an unmet need now, in terms of a lack of housing to meet the need identified. We're into that London plan period. Secondly, Havering's local plan is at an advanced stage. It's at a main modification stage, and the main modification text identifies an unmet need from Havering, which is an adjoining authority. And thirdly, this is an area which is really very well connected, both in terms of the transport connectivity and the reality of where people work to London. There's a very strong commuting and migratory links, as shown in the council's own evidence, with London. And in those terms, it does seem to me that this is a significant issue that does need to be considered now.
Thank you, Mr. Ireland. There's no more hands up on that particular point. On those points that have just been raised by Mr. Hollingworth and Mr. Ireland, and then by Mr. Berend, can I turn to the council now, just to please pick up in response to those points, and in particular the issue of London and Havering. The situation there, and how the council has taken account of the position there, and how it's taken account of the position in those areas, and why it's come to the view it has.
Yes, thank you. I'll start on a technical housing basis, and I think Mr. Drain will take you through document F5B. But first, on a technical point, of course, the London Plan is not adopted, as we know. We don't know when it will be adopted. I'm doing lots of work in London, and we wish we knew when it was being adopted, and we wish we knew what the final document would look like, but we're not there yet. But on a technical basis, it is not the case that the council has not engaged repeatedly with the GLA on issues of housing need and compatibility between this plan's housing need and the GLA's view of housing need. This is discussed reasonably extensively in the council's old SHMAR documents. We actually worked with GLA demographers to see if we could align the Brentwood plan with the GLA plan. As the SHMAR points out, the GLA's view is that Brentwood's housing need, its demographic housing need, is actually much lower than the current standard method and the current 2014 household projections. Of course, that is slightly immaterial to us because we are a standard method plan, but it is the case that the GLA we have engaged with, and we have engaged on housing numbers, and the GLA's view, as expressed in their demographic projections, was that our need is lower. So that has been the case and explained in the SHMAR. As far as the formal duty to cooperate paperwork goes, I think Mr. Drain is just going to come on to that.
Inspector, just point towards the fact that as Mr. Pestil's set out, there has been continued engagement with the GLA on these issues, as well as the London Borough of Havering in terms of our direct neighbours. We set out within the SA process, the SA published in January 2019 as part of the submission, as part of the Reg 19 stage and going into submission later, that is a consideration that we've looked at, is that particular issue that is being raised by people here. And the way in which London should be looking to deal with that unaddressed issue in terms of shortfall through its London plan. As we've already said, the London plan is not yet adopted. It's not a standard method plan, so it's very difficult to apply across the two in terms of the way in which we've been looking at it. I think that the important point is that there's been no assumption by the GLA that what we were talking about in terms of the uplift, which recognises the change from objectively assessed need to standard method, was to deal with London's needs. It is to reflect the fact that we were in a situation whereby the calculation for need, as we understood it at that time, was changing. And more fundamentally, I suppose, in terms of the wider aspects of planning, we would expect that London would be thinking through its London plan, through its individual authorities, about the way in which increasing needs are to be met in constrained environments. And Brentwood Council, being a small authority on the edge of London, wholly within the Greenbelt, is unlikely to be able to meet London's unmet need in its entirety, as seems to be suggested here. So from our perspective, we are not an unwilling partner. We are trying to plan for the needs of the local area and think about the way in which we relate to our neighbours, but there is no situation whereby we are being asked or told to meet local needs from elsewhere.
Thank you, Mr. Drain, Mr. Pestell. Some people wish to speak now, and I think Mr. Burant first, then Mr. Taylor, and Mr. Hollingsworth. So, Mr. Burant.
Thank you, sir. And apologies if I keep coming in and out. Miss Feeney has said I'm a bit blurry or something in terms of my voice at the moment. My internet connection seems to be coming in and out, so apologies if I suddenly freeze. But in terms of what Mr. Drain has just iterated, I don't think it's actually necessarily about being asked to meet unmet need. There needs to be a consideration of the evidence that is available to it. And the evidence in October 2019 from the inspector's report that there was going to be a significant level of unmet need. There was an evidence prior to that was going to be lower level of unmet need, but still a level of unmet need, and the council were aware of that, and the Mayor of London did ask for willing partners. So there was a dialogue on that, and it should have been considered. I don't think anyone is suggesting that the entirety of London's unmet need should be met within Brentwood. But there does have to be a consideration of the proportion of that which could be met in Brentwood, given the potential impacts on Brentwood from that unmet need. So it's a consideration of that, and that is what paragraph 60 of the NPPF needs. It needs to be taken into account when considering what the minimum, the number of houses that should be delivered within Brentwood should be. So I don't think anyone is suggesting that the entirety of London's unmet need Brentwood, but it needs to be a consideration. It shows a failure of the effective cooperation between London and the rest of the boroughs in the southeast, including Brentwood, to actually grapple sensibly and appropriately with this issue. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, sir. Just very, very briefly, firstly, to associate with what Mr. Brent has just said, in fact, pretty much covered what I would have wanted to say, but it seems to me, listening to the arguments we've heard, this is about a consideration of these factors and showing how these factors have been looked at during the plan formulation process, understanding that there is always a process of changing needs, particularly with the London plan, and that's been going on for some years. But the result needs to be some flexibility and some contingency within the plan that results here, and that's what's missing at the moment with the number and the supply that we see. And I appreciate we're not talking about supply now, but that seems to be the key essence of where we're getting to with this. So thank you, sir.
Sorry, I was on mute then. Mr. Hollingworth.
Oh, thank you, sir. Sorry, I don't mean to repeat myself, but I wasn't clear from the council's response there in respect to the point on the engagement with the GLA. Just to confirm that F3B does say that the GLA welcomed the provision of a buffer on top of the local housing need as calculated through the standard method. So clearly their response was in the context of a misunderstanding, in our view, that the council were providing a significant buffer on top of the local housing need as per the standard method, not the SMAR figure. And I just sought clarification that the council had gone back and confirmed that with the GLA, because obviously that could influence the GLA's view on that position. Secondly, obviously I can't speak for all participants, but we're certainly not suggesting that Brentwood Borough should be taking all of London's housing need either. I think that'd be a pretty absurd suggestion, frankly. But I think, and clearly there are constraints within the borough which have to be taken into account as well. But and whilst I appreciate this will be a matter to discuss later on as part of the examination, it nevertheless is pertinent to note that in preparing this local plan, the council has rejected the allocation of sites that its own evidence base suggests are suitable, available and achievable for development. And I don't think we can really lose sight of that in the context of discussion about whether the council could have accommodated additional unmet need from neighbouring areas. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Hollingworth. Mr. Banner has his hand raised, so can I bring Mr. Banner in, please?
Thank you, sir. Firstly, can I just endorse what Mr. Hollingworth has just said about the constraints not being a complete answer given this assessment of sustainability. I just want to flag up the sustainability appraisal squarely recognises, so on page 15, the issue of London's unmet needs, but then doesn't follow through that logic by testing it as or testing the ability to deliver some of that as an alternative. There are three. Yesterday, I think it was, or maybe the day before, I used the word resilience. One of the questions just for you and your fellow inspector to consider, is this a plan that really is resilient? Because I think that issue arises here in the context of London and some of the other interlinked questions, because ultimately, whether or not London's unmet needs are planned for by this plan, and ditto in relation to neighbouring authorities, the reality is going to be that people whose needs aren't provided for London are going to be looking to this area for their homes, because whatever the plan does and doesn't do, you can't stop people from looking to Brentwood for their homes. And what that's going to mean is, in reality, that's going to mean people in the area are going to be displaced, or they're not going to have their needs met. And so this is a plan that doesn't reflect that reality, and compounded, or that is compounded by the issues in relation to the potential challenges of deliverability in relation to Dunton that we've touched upon already. And it's these things all intertwined to mean that this plan is not a resilient one in its current form. And I do ask you to bear that in mind, that quite rightly you're asking the questions separately, but they all do have a synergy to produce the result. This is not a resilient plan.
Thank you, Mr. Banner. Can I turn to the council now, please, and ask them to, if they can respond to the points that have been made by the last speakers. Mr. Drain or Mr. Pestall, I don't know who's going to lead off on this.
Thank you, Inspector. I'm sure there's too much more to say. We have engaged with the GLA, and coming back to Mr. Hollingsworth's point, there was post consultation after the Regulation 19 version in terms of the addendum. Whilst that didn't specifically deal with that issue, there is opportunity for the GLA to comment on that, and we've engaged with them further through this process. There's been no issues raised by them regarding any misunderstandings, as seems to be suggested. We don't know on that point. That's not been anything seeming to be misunderstood from our perspective. And in terms of the points made about migration and the way in which people might look to Brentwood to move, calculations are taking into account those issues within the evidence and assessments that we've made. So we believe we've taken account of these points. We're keen to get a plan in place that delivers homes. I appreciate what we're talking about is the number of homes that we may be delivering, and a debate about calculations. But ultimately, we're all probably in agreement that homes need to be delivered. And this is a plan that seeks to deliver those in line with the requirements that we have before us.
Thank you. And in terms of the points that have been made, in that, if I'm expressing this rightly, that people are saying that it's not just about whether you've been asked to accommodate need, but how have you assessed how you could accommodate that need. Where is there anything particular that you could draw my attention to, or is it a combination of it's in the housing need topic paper, it's in the essay, it's in the SHMA, it's in the text to the plan? Is there anything particular where you could say, well, we've actually looked at London's need and we've decided that we cannot, or it's not appropriate for us to accommodate it?
I think it's very difficult to compare like for like, in the sense that we're talking about differences from the London plan being objectively assessed need and as being a standard method plan. I can't at this very moment point to exact areas where we can look at that, but as has been referenced, there is reference to London Plan needs, unmet needs within the sustainability appraisal, page 15, as has been referenced. There has been testing of higher numbers through that process, even if they're not in terms of exact figures right now because of the history of the plan making process and the fact that we've always tried to test higher numbers and consider those. And of course, I suppose that the aspect of what the council is grappling with here is a wider strategy that goes beyond just meeting housing needs in terms of delivering sites. So coming back to that point about the suitability of sites elsewhere that have been discounted on the basis of the other strategy things that have been considered in terms of greenbelt, environment, character, whatever it may be. So that would be our response.
Thank you, Mr. Drain. My colleague Inspector, Mrs. Wright, has a question. Mrs. Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. It's just on that particular point, so you may well have been coming on to that, so my apologies if I've interrupted. I just wanted some clarification because mention has been made about what paragraph 11 says in the NPPF, and I just wanted to ask the council or to query the council on what it specifically says about the plan making under that section, which under part B of paragraph 11, which says that strategic policies should as a minimum provide for objectively assessed needs. I know that a lot of participants are stating that, and other uses, and we've heard the evidence on that. But when it comes to the, as well as any needs that cannot be met within neighbouring authorities, there is then a footnote, which then states that these are as established through statements of common ground. Now, as part, obviously this framework came into place over a year and a half ago. So did the council, when this framework came through, did they start to look at that in relation to setting this out within statements of common ground, specifically looking at unmet needs and going and discussing that with the authorities? Or the neighbouring areas, I should say, because it's not neighbouring authorities, which has been noted, it's neighbouring areas. Could council just clarify that point, please?
Thank you, Inspector. We've engaged with the GLA. There is no statement of common ground with them. We engaged with them specifically to ask about that. That is something that they suggested to us was something that was not required. We can provide more information if that is helpful. But to answer the question, there is no statement of common ground currently with the GLA. In document F3A5, I think, is where that's explained.
So again, this was discussed earlier this week. Was it because that just wasn't picked up as a necessity in relation to producing a statement of common ground? I think you mentioned that earlier some statements of common ground haven't been picked up because it was the time element. You wanted to, I think you mentioned earlier in the week, you wanted to focus on getting the plan out to consultation, getting the plan submitted, because you are aware that you need to get a plan in place as quickly as possible. So is that still the focus, your sort of reasoning behind why there hasn't been significant progress made on producing these statements of common ground as part of the plan preparation process?
Thank you, Inspector. That's the situation with regard to when the plan was submitted. It doesn't necessarily mean, obviously what we've tried to do more recently is pick up statements of common ground wherever they're required. More recently, as you've seen in terms of what we've been able to publish. I don't think that that's the reason why the GLA specifically was not picked up. As I said, we were in communication with them, and it was, I would need to look into it in more detail, but it was decided that there was no need for that statement of common ground from the perspective of our positions. I think the fact that just to come in, just to explain more in terms of what I'm trying to say there, that the GLA's point is that they did not feel it was necessary on the basis that there is no unresolved issues, particularly in regard to unmet need, but any other issues as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Warden.
Thank you, Mrs. White. Mr. Ireland.
Thank you, sir. I'd just be interested in the council's view regarding essentially the same question in respect of Havering, because my understanding is the text in Havering's plan identifies that there is an unmet need against its OAN. Now, as far as I'm aware, there's a statement of common ground with Havering, but that doesn't mention the issue of unmet needs, and therefore I'm not clear of whether this is an issue that either hasn't been discussed with Havering, or that there is essentially an impasse between the authorities.
Thank you, Mr. Ireland. Mr. Drain.
Thank you, Inspector. There's certainly no impasse. It would be stated as an issue if there were. The situation with Havering is that they have agreed with us that there is no unmet need. There's no request by them to meet any unmet need, or that they will be dealing with that through their local plan process. So it is not an issue for us. It is something that we picked through the statement of common ground with them.
Mr. Ireland, are you?
So, well, my understanding is that there is an unmet need, and this is a neighbouring authority, and therefore it does appear that this is an issue, and in terms of an unmet need from Havering, that simply hasn't been considered as part of this plan making process as I think it should.
Can we get some clarity on that point, please, Mr. Drain?
Thank you, Inspector. It is not something that Havering have raised with us. We've been in engagement with them. We have looked through the statement of common ground that we've published with them and gone through points in detail. It is not something that they are raising with us in terms of a situation whereby they are saying that is something that they would need us to help them with.
So are Havering, is that the position that Havering are taking with other authorities, or is that specifically a position with regard to Brentwood?
I'm afraid I don't know, Inspector.
Mr. Banner.
Thank you, sir. Sorry, my hand keeps bobbing up and down. It's a computer problem. I mean, you've once again heard slightly careful language, I suggest. Initially, Mr. Drain said there was no unmet need. Now they've not raised it with us. I would ask you just to examine that language very, very carefully. We've made very clear in our hearing statements our understanding by reference to Havering's main modifications. There is an unmet need in Havering. That is a fact. All you're told is they've not raised it with us. And I'd really go, the point I made on the first day about it in the context of duty to cooperate applies here. Just because they haven't raised it, if that is the case, doesn't mean that's the end of the matter, because these are matters that have to be looked at objectively. There may all be all sorts of political other reasons why a formal request hasn't been made. That doesn't mean the needs go away. That doesn't mean the people don't need the houses. That doesn't mean they're not going to get their houses if no one's been requested. So it's not the complete answer that this council appears to think it is.
Thank you, Mr. Banner. I'll ask Mr. Drain to come in a moment. Mr. Hollingworth.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to clarify, because I'm conscious we're sort of straying into duty to cooperate matters, or it seems to me we are, but our position is that these are soundness issues in the plan, but they are soundness issues that can be readily cured. These aren't incurable defects. And I just want to emphasise, I think it was Mr. Banner himself who said on day one of the examination, we are dealing ultimately with real homes for real people, and the absolute worst outcome for the borough and the wider area would be if this local plan were to be deemed beyond repair, so to speak. And I think it is imperative that this plan is ultimately rectified, for want of a better phrase, through this examination process, and we do proceed to adoption of a sound local plan. But so I just wanted to clarify that is our position on that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Drain, would you like to respond to Mr. Banner's point about the particular issue about Havering and whether, notwithstanding that they may not have requested in relation to unmet need, is Brentwood's understanding that there is an unmet need in Havering, and how has the council considered that in putting forward its housing requirement in SB 02A?
Thank you, Inspector. I'll come to my colleague in terms of exactly how that's been calculated. But my understanding of the Havering position is that their plan is an objectively assessed need plan based under the old London plan. So we're talking about a different thing in terms of the level of calculation that we're both looking at in terms of what our old objectively assessed need was and the significant uplift that we're now looking to plan for under the standard method. So that's one thing in terms of how the two have been looked at. But this sort of suggestion that we may not have been, well, I won't say it's a suggestion. The fact remains is we remain in engagement with Havering, and we've discussed this issue with them throughout the plan making process and since submission in terms of the statement of common ground point that we've been working with them on. There has been no point at which they have raised the issue with us that there is needs that need to be met by Brentwood.
So if I may just stress something that Mr. Drain just picked up on, and I think it's the complication for Brentwood to understand from its neighbours if we are not directly told that there is unmet need from our neighbours, because these different plans are all working under different systems with different dates and different targets. And the Havering plan we've just been talking about, as Mr. Drain has pointed out, is a 2015 based London plan target. It is not even the same unmet need that various participants were talking about earlier flowing from the emerging London plan. So the borough really needs its neighbours to help understand when we do have a quantified unmet need and to deliver it. And I think a lot of what you're hearing from the borough is that need is very rarely expressed to this district about what quantum we are expected to test and take from them.
Thank you. So in terms of Mrs. Wright's question about the planning for in paragraph 11, planning for neighbouring areas and statements of common ground. I mean, just to highlight, what would the council say in terms of that position being set out in statements of common ground as advocated through the through the framework?
Thank you, Inspector. I understand your question rightly. We've explored that issue in engagement throughout the plan making process and expressed what the issues that remain or that remain within the statement of common ground with the London Borough of Havering. We do not have a statement of common ground with the Greater London Authority.
Thank you. Mr. Ireland.
Thank you, sir. Just two short points on this. The first one is that however this number is calculated, I don't think it particularly affects the issue, because the standard method figure for Havering at 1,910 dwellings per annum is higher than its subjectively assessed need as assessed previously, which was a figure of 1,366 dwellings per annum. So if anything, the scale of that unmet need, as the basis of the calculations change, rises. My second point would really be in terms of, Mr. Drain has told us that this is an issue which has been discussed and considered with Havering, but in those terms, that, as I see it, should follow through to that statement of common ground, which doesn't address the issue.
Mr. Drain, is there anything can you respond to the points that Mr. Ireland has raised?
Right. Shall I just make a technical point before Mr. Drain goes back to duty corporate and other matters? I think Mr. Ireland has raised Havering's new standard method number. Now, as I was illustrating, the difficulty with Havering is that actually the Havering plan is a 2015 London plan. There is a new London plan that Havering have not yet engaged with. That new London plan is not a standard method plan. It is a continuation of an OAN plan. Havering and the London plan and the GLA have not yet even considered what a new standard method may be for London. So it simply illustrates the multiple numbers that we could generate to illustrate an unmet need, and the fact that none of these numbers quantify an unmet need for Brentwood.
Thank you. Mr. Drain, you were going to...
Thank you. I'm just having to refresh myself on the statement of common ground with the London Borough of Havering, just as we're speaking. Ultimately, our position is this is not an issue that has been raised in terms of discussion with Havering and Brentwood. It is therefore not something that is set out within the statement of common ground specifically, but it is referenced there in terms of meeting needs and the fact that each other's authorities, in terms of Havering and Brentwood, we support Havering support our position that is trying to meet our needs as we understand them, and has not been raised that we've got additional needs to consider from Havering specifically.
Thank you, Mr. Drain. I'd like to move on, and can I just ask about whether the council considers that the we've heard a lot about the economic aspirations of Brentwood, and in particular the transit corridors, and we've heard about the Elizabeth line. In terms of meeting its economic ambition and taking the opportunities that Brentwood presents in terms of that infrastructure and its strategic location, are we satisfied that the figure actually makes provision for those opportunities that the spatial strategy clearly articulates? I'll turn to the council, please.
Right. Sorry. On the first point about meeting our economic needs, I think as it's set out in our housing topic paper, the council has tested emerging housing targets to ensure that the council's housing target never constrains the economic ambitions of the borough, or constrains our economic need. That testing is set out in the original SHMA, and it is also dovetailed with the council's economic evidence. I think there is a specific point being raised about Crossrail, and I know we will disagree with some of the participants about the material effect of Crossrail on our housing need. I would just draw your attention to the fact, I think the Crossrail Act, I think was 2008. We have been talking about Crossrail in this borough since year dot. We have continued to see an increase in housing need and an increase in migration from London in our trend-based projections, and that is part of the reason why our 2014 based projections are higher than past ones. This, the council has always reflected in its evidence, but we consider there's no need for an additional Crossrail uplift on our housing need because, as explained in the housing topic paper, Crossrail is required to deliver trend-based growth across London, and that without Crossrail, it's very unlikely that the borough could continue to grow in line with our past trends.
Thank you. Mr. Drain, were you going to come in as well, or is that it from in terms of the
Thank you,
council's
Inspector. No, I don't have anything more to add from what Mr. Pestle said, as well as what our hearing statement says on the subject. I think that's explained in response to the question.
Do any of the participants wish to raise any questions in relation to that point? Mr. Hill.
Yes, thank you, sir. We've touched on this in our hearing statement, but I do want to say a little more about it now, if you'll permit me. There is obviously a degree of crossover between the significance of Crossrail / the Elizabeth line to the overriding or overarching housing requirement issues that you're looking at today, and the spatial strategy issues that you referred to and alluded to when you set this particular discussion in train. But our starting point is that the Elizabeth line, or as Crossrail is now known, is a nationally significant piece of infrastructure. It's not a local or regional, it is a nationally significant piece of infrastructure. Could not be of higher status. And in terms of the role of the borough, it has been chosen to take the northeastern terminus of this route. And both Shenfield and Brentwood stations are going to play a key role in connectivity once this new line is up and running. Third, in terms of linkages, Brentwood and Shenfield could not be better located to take one to Stratford terminals, London Underground, the City of London. You'll know that, I'm sure, from your general knowledge of the geography and the links that are in play in this part of Essex. In terms of the level of service, the council's IDP that accompanies this plan, paragraph 3.74 for your reference, sir, notes particularly that the Elizabeth line will increase capacity, especially at Brentwood station, from 12 trains in the peak to 24 trains in the peak. And the Crossrail trains will be brand new rolling stock. This is a dramatic uplift in the level of service. And so what do we have from the council in response to this nationally significant piece of infrastructure running right through their central transport corridor? Well, paragraph 19 of their hearing statement for this session. The councils say that patterns of commuting and economic demand are expected to remain largely as is, recognising that the Crossrail provides limited additional capacity over the current position. They've got it wrong, sir, and you are quite right, you and Mrs. Wright are quite right to pick up on the importance of this nationally significant piece of infrastructure right at the heart of the borough. What have we got as a response in terms of overarching housing need and spatial strategy and allocations? We don't have a single strategic allocation at Brentwood, which is going to see the great step change in the improvement to its service. This is a flaw in this plan, so you and Mrs. Wright need to recognise it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. I am dealing with the overall requirement for Brentwood, not at this stage considering specific allocations, but thank you, Mr. Hill. Mr. Ireland and then Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, sir. I think I'd like to just ground this point within the planning practice guidance first of all, and the relevant reference there is paragraph 2A10 in the practice guidance, so 2A10, which sets out, which deals with when it might be appropriate to plan for a higher figure than the standard method. And that paragraph sets out that the standard method is a minimum starting point, that it doesn't reflect predicted changes in terms of policy factors or things that might affect demographic behaviour. And then it gives specific reference to some things which might need to be considered and where there might be essentially a case for a higher housing provision than the standard method. And strategic infrastructure improvements is one of those items that is specifically identified in that part of the planning practice guidance as providing a basis in some areas for essentially the actual need for housing being higher than arises through the standard method. So that's the first point. My second point is that when I look at the council's SHMAR, that's document C19. Mr. Pastel said that this is a factor that's been known since 2008 in the borough, but that document C19, which was considering the scale of housing need, makes no reference to Crossrail or the Elizabeth line at all. So there's no reference in the core piece of evidence on housing needs to Crossrail. So it seems as though it was just not a factor that was considered at the appropriate point in terms of housing need. And then, so if I look on to the detail around what Crossrail was intended to do, I have been back through and looking at this issue to some of the documentation that was prepared by Crossrail Limited itself, including the business case and the wider economic benefits component of the business case for Crossrail. And what that talks about, so is that essentially central London is one of the UK's largest concentration of employment. But one of the constraints to growth of that employment is essentially an issue of getting people to work in central London. The transport network is on many lines into central London is at capacity. And a major component of the business case for Crossrail, why Crossrail has been brought forward, is to address that issue and to provide additional capacity to essentially to bring people into central London to work. And by implication, if you set and you develop a line that runs east-west through London and out to this area, now, whereas people can't get on trains coming in on other routes into central London because of the capacity, the major investment that's been made here provides the ability and a growth in capacity that allows that to happen. And that affects households' decision making. For people working in central London who are looking at where they might live, the high quality, very frequent public transport links that bring them directly, without needing to change, to some of the major concentrations of employment in central London. The City, Farringdon, where both Mr. Pestle and I have an office, the West End. There's a direct train link with a high capacity, with very regular services that brings people to work. And that will affect essentially decision making about where households in the future, once Crossrail is fully open, will choose to move to. That's the impact of Crossrail. It's not just about providing additional trains for the demographic growth that might have been expected anyway. It's about enabling employment growth in central London and feeding additional workers into that area. That was a key component of Crossrail's wider economic benefits case. Now, I think we do need to look at we do then need to turn to look at the consequences for the borough if this isn't reflected in housing supply, because those factors mean that there will be a demand side response. Estate agents will see a greater number of people coming in seeking housing. Now, if that isn't addressed on the supply side of the equation, what you see is essentially those working locally or in lower paid roles being priced out by higher earners that are working within central London, with the negative social and economic consequences that could have, both for Brentwood's economy and for the people of the borough. That's why we say this is an important point. And our view that there will be essentially an additional demand arising from this is consistent with that original justification for why Crossrail was being brought forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Idend. Mr. Taylor and then Mr. Elliott.
Thank you, sir. Very, very short, just to say I can associate us both with what Mr. Hill's had to say and Mr. Ireland latterly largely covered the points I would have raised. But suffice to say, in summary, Crossrail is a beacon and a focus for people choosing to come and live and work in Brentwood. It's unacceptable, really, to have had so little regard to the importance of that investment, and given the time that it's been known how long and how much investment is being put in to deliver this national infrastructure. So I would simply say we endorse what has been said by both of those other speakers. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. I think Mr. Elliott.
Thank you, sir. Just a brief summation, if you like. We've heard various different reasons as to why the OAN and potentially unmet needs should be higher than what is being tested in this plan. And I just really wanted to point out that these are all going one way. We've got the council who's sticking to a baseline minimum figure, and yet we've got affordable housing, affordable ratios suggesting that affordability is a significant issue in this area. We have very clearly unmet needs from London. Without a doubt, it doesn't really matter what base you're talking about and things. We know that London isn't delivering much in comparison to its overall needs. And we've heard that there's this significant, nationally significant infrastructure coming in. Surely it follows that the minimum figure is not the figure we should be looking at. Surely it follows that something should be elevated from that. Now, unfortunately, because there's so many different things going on at this stage, we can't boil it down to a calculation and say definitively it should be X. But instinctively, it's got to be higher than the 456 that has been suggested, the very minimum. I would suggest that, given that this is a LHN standard method plan, we should be looking at the 511, which is only 55 dwellings per annum additional to what we had. We're not talking about, as has been suggested, that we try and meet the whole of London's need. We're not talking about that. We're talking about an uplift just to accommodate all these different things that are going on and just make the whole plan a little bit more flexible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Elliott. Can I turn to the council now, and can I just ask the council to address, I suppose, this different expectation or understanding of Crossrail and the impact that it is likely to have on the borough. I know we've touched on this on spatial strategy, and we may well come on to it in other sessions, but in relation to the housing requirement, can I hear from the council as to how it would respond to the points that have been made, and particularly those made by Mr. Ireland on the opportunities, Ireland and Mr. Hill, on the opportunities that Crossrail brings? Yeah, in terms of the housing requirement. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Right. If I start, and then Mr. Dre might interject. Before we go to the technical detail, I think it's worth just stepping back and looking at what actually Crossrail does for our stations in Brentwood. Now, I appreciate, apparently we have been gifted a new depot. It happens we already have a depot because that depot services the existing network and the existing trains that Crossrail replaces. So the council's point with Crossrail is it largely replaces our existing metro service that is an incredibly high frequency metro service into London as it is, and it already services the main best destinations and the economic destinations that Brentwood residents already commute to. Now, there is testing of Crossrail and its impact on our economic geography in the Economic Futures report, which we'll come on to probably this afternoon when you talk about economic needs. That work found that Crossrail does not change our FEMA. It does not change our economic geography. Our economic geography remains the same precisely because Crossrail largely duplicates existing network in this part of the world. So I think it's worth just thinking about that. And it's also worth considering that for most people in Brentwood, it is always quicker to go to London and to go to Stratford using semi-fast services that will always overtake Crossrail on their way into London. Crossrail is the slow route to London. We have a faster route into London for most our stations, the exception being Brentwood, which is not serviced by the fast trains or the semi-fast trains. So Crossrail doesn't increase time from Shenfield, it doesn't increase time from anywhere else, or it doesn't increase capacity from those stations. That's the first point, I think. The second point, I think, as Mr. Ireland quite correctly pointed out, Crossrail is there to accommodate continued growth of London. It is required to allow London to grow, and it is required to allow continued trend-based growth in London. Now, in terms of housing, the borough is meeting trend-based growth for housing with our 40% uplift on the standard method. So the council have always viewed that Crossrail is required in our baseline. Without Crossrail, we cannot continue trend-based growth, and our residents cannot continue to access London when they choose to commute to it. So it is largely a trend-based scheme in this part of the world. Mr. Ireland raised the SHMAR, and he suggested that we had not considered Crossrail in the SHMAR. The SHMAR at the time was required to consider market signals, including house prices, house price pressure, and all the various effects that you would expect to be influenced by Crossrail. So it doesn't explicitly test Crossrail, but in line with the guidance at the time, it tested the market signals for Crossrail. As a final point, I think Mr. Ireland has referred you to various technical evidence that Crossrail prepares themselves, monitoring their own impacts. As far as the Crossrail evidence is concerned, they break various stations into three groups, and the groups are ones where Crossrail expects limited impact on behalf of Crossrail, stations where they expect Crossrail to reinforce the direction of travel as to what is already happening, and Crossrail enables that direction of travel to continue, and they identify some stations as stations where Crossrail creates change. Now, Brentwood and Shenfield are both in the middle category. They are categories where Crossrail reinforces what is already happening. Essentially, it reinforces trend-based growth. We are not a transformational Crossrail station and never have been. And that is in Crossrail's view in their property market studies. If required, I can take you to the exact references, but we haven't put them in to this examination.
Thank you, Inspector. I have nothing further to add from what Mr. Pestle said.
The inspector's on mute, I think.
Thank you. Sorry. I shall ask Mr. Banner to come in. He has his hand raised up, and then if necessary, I should go back to the council, and then we'll move on. Mr. Banner.
Thank you, sir. You jinxed it this morning by saying no one had spoken with them. Mutual.
Yeah.
You walked straight into that. So Mr. Ireland's lost his connection, so I'm acting as him now. Just one point, sir, is that characterisation you just heard at Crossrail, I'd say, is completely unevidenced before you. It's pure assertion. Crossrail, we suggest, is trend setting, not trend following or trend based. It's plainly revolutionary and has been already. I mean, take for example Reading and Slough, etc. There's Mr. Patel's approach is for take Slough money, it wouldn't be worth having Crossrail. And so we just say that doesn't withstand any scrutiny, is completely without evidence. Mr. Arnhem might come back if there's anything else you want to say, if he's able to get a connection, but that's the main point. I'd say take what you just heard with a very large pinch of salt.
Mr. Banner, thank you. Mr. Hill.
Thank you. So very briefly, my immediate response is what a mealy-mouthed response we have from the council on this, getting this magnificent piece of infrastructure right through the heart of its borough. All it can say is we're getting a new depot for maintenance. I mean, it simply doesn't grasp the enormous opportunity it's being offered, paid for by the national public purse. And so whatever Mr. Pestle may say about Shenfield, the council's own case is that Brentwood, at the heart of the borough, will see a dramatic increase in capacity. And that's where we say the real opportunity has been missed, both in terms of the overarching housing number and in the spatial strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Mr. Ireland, you're back on connection. Have you got anything to add to what Mr. Banner raised when you were not able to speak? Mr. Ireland?
So can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes. Can't see you, but I can hear you. So did you get my question, Mr. Ireland?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Mr. Ireland,
yes.
Have you got anything to add to Mr. Banner?
Just one there's just one further point.
We're struggling to hear you, Mr. Ireland.
So just one further point, which is tighter, is flatted housing.
I'm struggling
much of what's being delivered in London at the moment.
Inspector, I wonder if you could ask Mr. Ireland to dial in.
If it helps, sir, I think his point is that much of the new housing London is flattered housing, and I think what he's likely to be saying is that the opportunity presented in this district is to provide a qualitative opportunities for housing that aren't presented within London. I don't know that's what he's going to say, but it seemed from what I heard of what he's going to say that joining the dots, that's probably what he's going to say. Yeah, but hopefully we'll hear it from the horse's mouth.
I certainly heard flatted development, so thank you. I don't want to dwell on this point actually, and I'm quite content with what Mr. Banner has said. If that is the point, Mr. Ireland.
Yes, I think it's covered, sir.
Thank you. Right, we'll move on. Can I just ask the council if they have anything to respond to the points that have been made, and then we'll move on very briefly. I know, Mr.
Yeah. So just a very quick point in response to the western end of Crossrail. We did look, and we addressed in our matter statement at paragraph 20 and 21, we did look at the western end of Crossrail and what the councils at the western end of Crossrail, including Reading, had been doing and what their SHMAs and housing advisors had been advising. And there is no Crossrail uplift at the western end of Crossrail, despite the fact that at the western side of Crossrail is a brand new electrified line replacing, well, not a new line, the line exists. It is an electrification of a substandard diesel service between Slough and Paddington. It is a different step change in connectivity to what Crossrail delivers here, where Crossrail here largely replaces the existing metro service.
Thank you. It is now 11:10, and I've got a few more questions in relation to this issue, but largely through it. I suggest that we take a quick break now and return. So it's 11:10, and would a break of 15 minutes be acceptable? So if it's now 11:10, so if we return at 11:25, and we'll continue on this issue. So thank you very much. We'll return at 11:25. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hope everyone's suitably refreshed. We're going to press on fairly speedily now on this matter, and I've just got around about 3 more particular questions that I'd like to explore, but they won't be taking as long as the main issues that we've dealt with already this morning. Can I just look at the issue of the stepped trajectory, which the council submitted a trajectory in the plan that was stepped in terms of the requirement, and the council is now suggesting that that no longer needs to be taken forward in that way. So I don't want to stray on to supply, but can I understand what has changed, and what's the late, what has influenced in particular that issue about changing that requirement back to a general requirement for the plan period?
Okay, thank you, Inspector. So yes, the trajectory has been proposed to be removed from being a stepped trajectory to being following just the 456 per annum. And as was set out in our original topic paper, the housing supply topic paper, it set out that we would propose to remove that based on the updates to the trajectory figures. So we'd obviously had to look at going back to when the plan was prepared for the Reg 19, that was at the back end of 2018. Obviously time has moved on since then in terms of since we submitted the plan, reviewed some of those figures, and for some of the sites. The main, it's not necessarily changed the individual numbers. There's been some that have been moved over to being extant permissions, for example. So there's a couple of sites which have moved over to being an extant permission and therefore removed as proposed allocations for that reason. And some of those had different numbers, not significant, but some are different numbers. And in terms of more recently, in terms of the F26 document, we had the updated trajectory that set out an updated figure, principally around Dunton Hills. So that obviously again influenced that number. But in any case, the figures that were shown in that updated trajectory, the totals for each year, were showing that the 456 dwellings per annum would be met in those periods. Obviously acknowledging that towards the tail end of the plan period, as shown in that document, that we would be under that number. But we feel that the numbers that were originally set out in the plan, the 310 and the 584, that they would no longer be appropriate in terms of what we would set out as being what could be delivered as part of that policy. So there's sort of changes from that perspective in terms of timeframes and some situations in terms of sites. And also just to add to that equally with the completion figures, obviously we've been adding them on as the monitoring data has been published. So that obviously is put onto that table as well. So that sort of updates there.
Is again, we're not wanting to talk about supply, but the most recent trajectory position for the council has changed some of the early delivery expectations, and that post dates the suggestion by the council to remove the stepped approach. So my question is, does that latest information reverse that position at all? Does that come into play in looking at whether the position as in the submitted plan actually is the correct position in terms of that stepped approach?
So sorry, just to clarify, so in terms of is it a question regarding the figures as they were submitted in terms of sorry, I've lost the thread of that.
Yeah, so the council has submitted there's an updated trajectory in one of the documents that changes some of the expectations on housing delivery, and pushes principally Dunton Hills and pushes it back and also reduces the number. My question to you is, does that most recent information mean that the case for a stepped trajectory is stronger than it was when the council submitted its proposal that it wasn't to be a stepped trajectory?
Right, that's totally understand. Thank you. No, so, I mean, obviously, as the figures are set out in that table, we're still showing that there is a delivery based, not just obviously principally on Dunton, that has changed, but the other sites still cumulatively add up to the requirement of the 456 per annum as set out in that table. So our view is that there's still not a need for a step trajectory based on what's been presented.
Thank you. I have a further question on this, but Mr. Barant has got his hand up. Mr. Barant.
Thank you, sir. I think it's with the latest information in terms of F26 and the council's justification in terms of the 5 year supply and not needing a step anymore. We don't believe that there is a need. They should be planning for a step trajectory and a flat trajectory which can take into account. But on the basis of what the council is saying, that on their 5 year supply, they haven't included any backlog in terms of what was delivered in the first 4 years of the plan, which would suggest that either that's been forgotten and there won't be enough housing supplied on terms of the requirement, or that there needs to be an increase from the period of 2021 forward. I'm just confused in terms of why there's no backlog in the 5 year supply calculation F26, which relates to the issue of the step trajectory and how that's going forward. So it's probably more for the future session in terms of 5 year supply and land supply overall. But it seems to be a disconnect in terms of actually, if the council is saying actually there's no backlog, then actually there is a step trajectory, because they're using the current the supply figures from those first 4 years as the requirement, and then moving into that 4, 5, 6. So I'm just confused, and it might be that I misunderstood in terms of there's somewhere else out there in terms of it explains the council's position, but there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between the two, sir.
Mr. Coulter, just able to answer that point for me?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you for raising that. In terms of the document F26, and as it was previously set out in the housing supply topic paper, obviously F26 updates that. So the 5 year land supply does take account, or obviously it's following the application of a 20% buffer in terms of the housing delivery test. So table 1 within F26 sets out obviously how we've calculated that 5 year supply. So effectively, the 5 year calculation based on the trajectory would be using a figure of 547 dwellings per annum. So that's an inclusive of that 20% buffer. So the housing delivery test would take account of unmet needs in previous years. I think it's also important to add in terms of the other figures that we've set out within, I think it may be another matter 6, I think in the Dunton Hills paper, not straying into that, but within that document, it does explain in terms of the delivery of homes over from the point of adoption, assumed to be next year. Obviously, that would effectively take account of that backlog in effect. So obviously, the application of the 456 across the plan period in terms of those calculations. But just in terms of the point being raised, our view is that we are taking account of the way that we'd need to calculate it would be applying that 20% buffer as per the housing delivery test.
Mr. Barant, you got a follow-up?
Yeah, it's just that the 456 is across the entire plan period, which is 2016 to 2033. So which means that the 456 for the first 4 years of the plan, there would be a backlog in terms of what was supplied, because the supply was a bit lower than what the requirement was. So therefore, there would be a backlog going forward. So the 456 from 2020 would actually need to be higher moving forward if you're saying that it's 0 at 2020. So I just don't understand where the council are coming from in terms of actually how it's assessing the backlog within the plan period going forward across that in terms of the trajectory. you would expect a plan which from started 2016 and with 4, 5, 6 that the backlog within those 4 years would then be required to be delivered within the next 5 years, according to PPG. So you'd use the Sedgefield methodology. Yet that backlog isn't included within that, but the requirement is still 4, 5, 6. So ultimately, you won't deliver the full housing need if you hit your requirement all the way through. So it's perhaps I'm not understanding it, or I'm not being very clear, but I'm not sure where that backlog in delivery for the first between 2016 and 2020 is considered by the council within the step trajectory and within the overall housing land supply. Again, I don't want to go into the supply because that's not what you want to talk, but it's actually how does it relate to the trajectory?
I think just to Mr. Coulter, if you can answer that, but your position, Mr. Brandt, is that I think that there shouldn't be a step trajectory. I think
yes, that's correct, sir.
And the council's position now is that there shouldn't be a stepped trajectory. That's correct, isn't it? So if there isn't a stepped trajectory, is your question still valid, Mr. Brandt?
The question is whether actually the council are. The evidence would suggest that they are having a step because they're stepping the first 4 years of that of the trajectory, because there's they're not considering a backlog within the 5-year housing land supply. They've got a 20% buffer, which is a requirement, but their plan period is 2016 to 2033. Yet those first 4 years, there is no. Despite delivering below 4, 5, that backlog is then not considered. So I'm just not. I don't understand how the council approach it. Perhaps I will set it out in more clearly. I think in statements moving forward to land supply might be more appropriate. But I'm just it's how the trajectory is considered at the moment in terms of actually is it a flat trajectory across 4, 5, 6 from 2016. All the way through to 2033, but if there is no backlog applied on the adoption of the plan for those first 4 years, which are part of the plan supply, then the trajectory would need to be higher across the rest of the period. But I'll set it out in statements for future method. But I think it just relates to the trajectory. We might have to come back to it at that point, sir, because it's to do with the changing evidence that's coming forward from the council and actually how to consider that. Because I didn't see that evidence before I put in my statements for this session, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Brandt. I think that's right. I think that. I think we'll return to that point when we start looking at land supply. Can I just ask another question on a step trajectory in relation to the council's addition? The council proposes to add words: the delivery and phasing of development sites is set out in the local development housing trajectory in Appendix 1. And that's a suggested change from the council. It has been raised by a respondent, but I would just ask as well whether this actually should be part of the policy, or rather it should be part of the supporting text, or indeed, does it need to be in there at all?
Okay, thank you, Inspector. Yeah, I think what we was trying to deal with on that point really was in terms of obviously the specific reference to Appendix 1 in the plan as submitted was the trajectory table. But I think we're obviously happy to make that policy as effective as possible in terms of where most appropriate, if that is to be within the policy or supporting text. But I think it was just to obviously it was to make sure that there was a clear link between what is expected to come forward and obviously what then is linked to the housing requirements. So there was a connection between those two, but I think we're happy to be flexible on that point from our perspective in terms of making sure that's as effective, and we can have a look at that.
Thank you. Can I just move on to two further points? One not on step trajectory. One question which my question 32 was about meeting needs outside of Brentwood, meeting whether any needs outside of any of Brentwood needs should be met outside of Brentwood, and the council has set that out in its housing topic paper. I just wonder whether any of the participants wish to raise any questions in relation to that, and whether the council wishes to add anything at this stage to that point in terms of meeting Brentwood need outside of Brentwood.
So from the council's point of view, we have nothing to add.
Okay. Thank you. Can I turn now to a question which was inadvertently placed into the wrong issue, and I apologise if that's caused any problems for any participants, but it's in relation to the neighbourhood plan. And can I check the current position on neighbourhood planning in Brentwood, and to see whether the position as set out in the council statement is correct, and that there are 3 designated neighbourhood plan areas: Doddinghurst, West Horndon, and Ingatstone and Freining. And I'm particularly interested in the meeting the responsibilities set out in paragraphs 65 and 66 of the framework, which sets out a requirement for identifying neighbourhood planning areas. So can the council just please confirm the position in relation to neighbourhood planning in Brentwood? And then I've got some further questions in relation to that point.
Yes, thank you, Inspector. So as set out in our response, it is the case that policy SPO2 does not set out housing needs for designated planning, neighbourhood planning areas. The assessment was done based on the borough as a whole, and taking into consideration the council's spatial strategy. We do have 3 neighbourhood plan areas, but only one which has progressed to Regulation 14. The other 2 have not progressed any further beyond being designated as far as we are aware. For the neighbourhood plan that was progressed to the Regulation 14, we did provide them an indicative number as required by paragraph 66 of the MPPF. And all of our site allocations include the name of the town or the parish for where those sites are allocated, so the council can, moving forward, continue to provide that information when needed.
Thank you. And which is the area that has moved to Regulation 14?
Ingatestone.
And Freining, is that?
Yes, yes.
And so in relation to, so is the council's position that it has met the framework requirement for a requirement to be set out for neighbourhood plan areas, or is it saying that well, that requirement has been met, but we consider that it to be dealt with in a different way? And in that, I just like to, I'm looking at the footnote as a reason why that might not be done. And the footnote says, footnote 31 says, because a neighbourhood area is designated at a late stage in the strategic policy making process, or after strategic policies have been adopted, or instances where strategic housing policies are out of date. And are those circumstances applicable here? I'm just trying to understand what is the council's position in not specifically identifying a figure for those areas.
Just a moment, Inspector, while I confer with my colleagues.
I'm happy for the council to
Yeah, no, apologies. I was just trying to find out what the timeframes were for the various neighbourhood plans before providing a response. So Ingatestone progressed with their neighbourhood plan following the time that we had set our spatial strategy and was in the late stages of our plan. The other two were designated as areas earlier, but no progress had been made on those, and that still is the case now.
Okay, so in terms of meeting the provisions of the framework, the council consider the provisions of the framework have been met.
Can I come back to you on that? Apologies.
Perhaps it might be helpful if we could receive perhaps an updated note from the council on this,
okay.
Which would specifically let us know where the position is in relation to those three areas.
Yep.
And understanding that the provisions of the framework in paragraph 65 and 66 have been met.
Okay.
I was going to suggest we do exactly that, sir. And what we could do then, if upon further consideration we think it's appropriate to include some words in the plan to satisfy the requirements of the NPPF, paragraph 66, we can do so.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shadow-Dravian. Yep. I don't have any more questions in relation to this particular issue. Mrs. Piper? Ms. Piper?
So,
I was lost. Annette, is Ms. Piper trying to speak and we've lost the connection?
Oh, we've lost the connection, Inspector. She might try and rejoin us. I'm just thinking, is she back later? No. So, just wait a minute. Oh, here she is. Hang on.
Apologies. Can you hear me?
I can hear you and I can see you. Thank you.
I've not had a problem at all until I came to speak, so I do apologise for that. It was just before we left SPO2 and really sort of thinking about the discussion we had yesterday about how that policy is likely to change, to take into account how the sites are set out that are going to fulfil this number. But I just wanted to just reiterate my client's perspective on this. You know, there isn't an adopted plan. There hasn't been for the last 15 years in Brentwood. It's a Greenbelt authority. Without the release of sites from the Greenbelt through an adopted plan, we're not going to get any sort of a delivery of homes for its residents. And it's just a point to say that, and that has been proven. Obviously, there's only just over a 2-year, 5-year land supply. And the HDT shows that they're nowhere near any of the numbers that were referenced this morning. So no matter what the number that inspectors choose, and no matter what the decisions are on the strategic growth location study, and indeed the sites coming forward, what I'd be looking for on behalf of my client is to allow enough flexibility in SPO2 to allow delivery for homes. Whether that's over the 15-year period or another period the inspectors choose to see fit, or indeed the actual annual amount, because there is no doubt that any significant delay in this plan, or indeed a restart, is not going to be in anybody's interest.
Thank you very much, Ms. Piper. I'd like to now draw this to a close, but I will just pick up any other comments that people wish to make that have not been covered in relation to the requirement. Okay, thank you. Is there anything from the council that they wish to conclude on?
No, sir. No, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for their contributions this morning. We've now got a short window before the affordable housing session starts. I know that not everybody is staying for that session, but can I just remind you that if you are staying, you'll need to log in using the new link and coming back through the lobby through the programme officer. So thank you very much, everyone, for your contribution, and we'll see you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.